Welcome back. We have Carl Collins now. He is a multidisciplinary designer and a visiting assistant professor of design at Pratt. Carl is going to teach us a few things about teaching. So.
You know, which is really great, because it's the most boring thing when someone like tells you exactly what they do, right? Like the thing that I do that I love most is teaching. And so I'm going to talk to you about that and try and make it interesting just because I love it so damn much. You know, like there's this whole phenomenon in giving a talk like this where you have to make it sound much bigger than it is. You know, so it's like when I think about teaching, it's like, well, I know how to teach product design. I'm pretty sure that's the only thing I know how to teach because I've been doing it for many, many years now. Back when it was called something else. Hasn't always been called product design, but it's fun that it's called that now. But there's this whole thing where you're like, oh, this has to be bigger than just like teaching product design. And we'll see if we can get there. So one of the interesting things is, you know, I didn't start off doing like this because, you know, I'm older now and this thing didn't exist back when I started off. And so I'm going to tell you about 3 teachers of mine. And the first teacher is this guy, Vinayak Chaturvedi. He is a professor of history at UC Irvine, where I did my undergraduate degree in history. And what's really amazing is he taught a class that is still the best class I've ever taken, right? And what he did is he started off with this question, right? He's like, it's a class on the history of India, and he asked this question: how did this happen, right? How did this huge population be controlled for so long by a much smaller group? And what he really did is he said, okay, we can read books about this, but that's not actually what historians do. He's like, you are taking a history class at a good university, I have a good education, and I'm going to share with you how I came to the conclusion. And so what he did is he gave us a bunch of documents. See, the great thing about the British is they love documents. And so it's actually easier to do history on the British rule in India than almost anywhere else in the entire world because there's so many documents. And he gave us documents, and he said, cool, read these documents. And we're like, no, this is a history course. You give us a book, we read the book, we report back to you the facts we learned in the book. He's like, no, the facts are in the book. The facts are in the documents. And he really wanted us to experience what he did in his PhD as undergrads. He's like, this is what history is. And so we would read these documents very, very closely, and we'd try to make stuff up. And he's like, no, you can't make anything up. You have to look at the documents, see what they say, and then find things in them. He was not just teaching us how to read documents, he was teaching us how to think about what the documents were saying. So if you look at a document from colonial India and you see that one area has a lot of cows and another doesn't, that means something very important in the context of India that doesn't mean the same thing anywhere else. And you can learn things about it. You're like, oh, they also pay more taxes. They're rich. They're Brahmins. They're treated better. They help in the rule because they're treated better. These other places that don't revolt sometimes. Why is that? Let's take a look at this, right? You look at his history. And now, he didn't just leave us all alone. He didn't have us read any histories of India in the class, but he did have us read other histories. Histories that are based on documents, including this book, which is still a book that I remember, because I remember everything about this class. And this book, The Cheese and the Worms, is about this dude in 16th century Italy who questioned the church, and the church didn't like that, and he was part of an inquisition. He was actually not killed the first time. He went through 3. But he also didn't learn from the torture what he was supposed to learn. He had this persistent question, which was, why do worms emerge spontaneously from the cheese? Right? Like sometimes you have a block of cheese and it goes bad and there's worms in it. Did God put the worms there? Is there something else at work that is not God? And that was the thing that this Miller had going for him. And he asked these questions, and he got a hold of secret books that he wasn't supposed to have and kept getting in trouble. And this is an amazing book that's all based off documentation because by this time inquisitions were sort of rare, and so they've advanced, and there's a lot of documentation about this particular guy's history. But it's not only interesting because it's well documented, it's interesting because he's a simple person. And I don't mean simple as stupid, I mean he's normal. He's not a king, he's not a prince, he's not a great artist, he's not anything. He's a normal person, but the documents present a story of what happened to him. They have the notes from his interrogations, so you can build a story of this man's life from historical documents. and and you can build the texture of it from other things that survive over time, which again is the work of history. And like really no bullshit, that's how you do it. So that's the first teacher. The second teacher is this guy. He's a nice guy. When he taught me, he was completely garbage at teaching. He's gotten better, so he reports. I haven't tried again. And this is really one of those things where, right, like he was teaching an information architecture course, and like he loves Christopher Alexander, and sure, but you don't give this book to students. Why? Because it's tedious, and it's like super like esoteric, the poetics of the stuff. And like, if you really love it, like when you arrive at a point that you really love it, this is a great book, it's super fun. But if you're just starting to figure this stuff out, you don't start here. You don't be like, here you go. And like, you know, part of Dan's confusion is like he loves James Joyce, right? Like he loves this sort of like esoteric exploration of ideas as the ideas themselves, the poetry of words. You know, Joyce wrote Finnegan's Wake, which is mostly nonsense garbage, which is, you know, has a very particular structure, and like people get obsessed with it. But once again, you have to have that obsession before you can approach it. You have to carefully arrive at that obsession. You just don't start off like super obsessed, like, I'm gonna go read Finnegan's Wake tomorrow. Don't do it. I mean, maybe you will now, I don't know. Maybe you're like contrarian. Anyway, one of the good things about this experience with Dan is I learned a lot about like, never do these things. But at the same time, he also has passions, and he did introduce me to Richard Saul-Wurman, who does a lot of things that Dan does, only does them even more poetically and cantankerously and annoyingly and obnoxiously. And he does have this thing, right, which just explains something clearly if you remember what it is like to not know. And this actually is one of those foundations that I did learn in this class that I really carried with me, because he has two sort of like, Richard Saul-Wurman speaks a lot in maxims and short little parables. And so one of those things is like, learning is remembering what you're interested in, right? So the more you can connect what you're doing to what you're interested in, the easier it is to learn it. This is like, yes, that's obvious, but it's also true and not written down enough. And when you're trying to teach, what you're actually trying to do is you're not trying to say, here's what this thing is. You're trying to take yourself several steps back and say, okay, there was a time when I didn't know this. What are the really important parts of this that I want to make sure somebody else knows? There we go. All right, and the third teacher was a guy I worked with. He's this guy. He looks so good. He makes such a good entrance. You know, Joe Stewart, partner at Huge. That's when I worked with him. Runs a company called Work & Co. Maybe you've heard of it. They do design stuff. I don't know. And like, you know, he taught me like that very basic lesson of design. And like, you know, it's you just do a lot of work because there's no other way. You don't ever get it right the first time. And even when you think you get it right, someone else disagrees with you. And you got to figure out a way to do more work to either prove that what you did was right or change it to make it something else. Right? And there's no other way that I've yet discovered other than spending a couple more hours on the design to get it somewhere else. And you do this over and over. Look, there's a time when it's done and there's deadlines and all that. But within that framework, there's still just hours of work that are involved, and it's always more work than you think it's going to be. And the more you can impart that, the better off you're going to be, because you've got to be honest about it. You can't be like, once you do this process, it will all work. It's like, yeah, it kind of works some of the time, right? And like his other thing was he was very big on like, design is part of this whole thing, right? You're working with other people. Those people are much, much smarter than you about whatever they're smarter than that, but they're not smart at design, and you work with them. And you work with them, and you work with them, right? And also, I mean, Joe's like a designer, right? Like, he sits down, he draws pictures of websites, and they're fucking great. That's what he does, he's really good at it, and like all the UX design, like talking to people, making personas, being empathetic, he's like, that's, you know, do it, but convince me it makes the final product different. I'm open to it as long as you convince me it's doing that. If it's just like a picture on the wall that looks nice, fuck it, fuck it, fuck it, fuck it. Let's go drink scotch, right? You know? And that's the thing, you know, like you gotta really be honest about this. Like we're still doing work at the end of the day. And you gotta connect it back to that if you're gonna connect it back to anything. And so, with those 3 stories, I'm going to like summarize this a little bit, right? So how to teach anything, or at least how to figure out how to teach product design. I'm now going to go on for 2 hours. No, right? So it's the very first part, and this is the thing that comes from all of these 3 teachers, is you have to be really clear-eyed, no bullshit, understand the work being done, right? Like, there's all this stuff about, oh, what is product design? I don't fucking care. There is work that is being done in these places. You need to know what it is, and as a teacher, you need to be able to explain it. You need to be able to do other things with which you can get to. One of the very important things is you need to encourage examination, right? So much about what I've learned and what I try and teach is this idea that so much of going out is looking at things differently, right? And so there's a story I tell, which I'm going to tell again, which is the story of Louis Agassiz, who was a science teacher whose methodology was mostly just telling his students to look at things. Right? Students would come to his classes like, this guy's brilliant, he's done all this great work, how does he do it? He's like, well, I look at things. And they're like, what do you mean? He's like, he would put a fish on an examining tray in front of them and say, look at your fish. And they would sort of look at it and they would go away and they'd come back next week and they're like, ready for this great class. And then the second class, he put the same fish. I mean, not the same exact fish, but, the same type of fish in front of them. And then, the students would examine it further because now they're like, oh, I have to like, go deep on this. all right, a little deep. And then you would come by at the end of class and sort of ask what they observed about the fish, and then they go away, and then the third week, the fish would be back. That's also because it's important. Like, good things happen in 3s. You know it's real. You know there's a little bit of magic when it's happening at the 3rd time. But it was really about teaching. This is a painting of a fish that he did because it's part of an observation. It's part of looking at the details. Part of taking it apart. Now, what we're doing is, if we look at the work being done, if we encourage examination, the next part is really this, which is you need to, as a teacher, make some sort of simulation. You have to make it so that the kind of challenges that show up, the kind of curveballs that show up, the kind of work, because you know what work's being done, is actually simulated as part of it. And that work actually has to be challenging. It has to be something that you can actually fail at. But like fail in the context of like, you will get a bad grade unless you fix this kind of failure. Right? Because part of the hours of the sweat is that you can overcome it. You can be told this is totally shit. You can be told that no, you fucked this up in such a way that you can recover because you can keep working on it. Right? And that's one of the big things about teaching anything is creating that duality where yes, you can fail, but also here's how you keep working on it, right? And of course, one of the big things about teaching is, as a teacher, don't exalt yourself too much, right? Because there's things that you're like, oh man, I love this part of it, and like, this is the best part. Is it really the best part, or did you just get like fascinated and like whatever about it, right? You gotta indulge yourself a little because, teaching has to be a mutually engaging medium, right? You have to be connecting with your audience, but you have to be also be connected with the stuff you're teaching, because if you're just, otherwise it gets too dry. Which relates to this next thing, which is like rely on engagement, right? Like, the more engaged your audience is, the more they'll go with you. And the less you have to use that authority of like, I am the teacher, right? Sometimes you just gotta use it because, they're students and they're like, whatever. Don't rely on the authority, rely on engaging them, right? And like, it's all this stuff, like connect with the obvious. The obviousness comes a lot. There's a lot of obvious stuff. And once again, connect to the obvious goes back to one of the earlier things. When you step back and you're like, oh, I didn't know this. It wasn't obvious when you started off, right? So it's obvious to you now, but you need to bring those things back up because you've forgotten that you learned it, and be honest about the challenges, be honest about the work, the rework, right? Because it's all about this. The more you go back to where you started, like really go back, the better you can teach anything.
We have some time for questions, I think.
Yes.
I have you were really, great presentation altogether, but you're really emphasizing the documents. You got some documents.
Well,
so how excited are historians for social media? The fact that everything...
Okay, so there's actually a woman who does social media research. Her name's Dana Boyd, all lowercase because it's part of her social media presence, right? And it's fascinating because there's 2 things that go on with that. One, there's more documentation than ever, but the second part of that is that how do you preserve it? How do you get access to these accounts, right? So where you're actually engaged in ethnographic research, contemporary ethnographical research, there's so much more documentation than there's ever been. But historical, it's actually all going away. And so there's actually this really interesting blend of both extreme access right now, but there's tons of media from the 80s that is completely unreadable, right? There's a great story actually from like the British, one of the British libraries or archives, like early on digitized the Domesday Book, which is classic British text. And then 15 years later, they realized they like put it on like a giant platter drive. And 15 years later, they had to do the whole project over again because they didn't have any machines left that could read the platter drive. Right? And there's all this, yeah, so there's a lot in there.
So it's like it's a two-sided sword.
Well, it's not great. There's new problems. Old paper still lasts longer, right? And this is something for all of you. Print some photos every year. Printed photos last much, much longer than anything on social media, right? So like if you like the photo, you know, just like, you don't need to print a lot of them, just like print 10 photos a year, then you'll have them, then you'll actually, that memory is something you can, you know, hand off to your child. Anyway, yeah, I could go on and on, sorry. Yes?
When's your TED Talk, and may I have a ticket, please?
You know, someday, maybe. I'll just, you know, see, Richard, who I know, so Richard Saul-Worman, he doesn't run it anymore. I can't use that. He wouldn't let me do it anyway, because, you know, he'd make me do some crazy Herculean task first. Yeah, anything else? All right.
So when you're looking at documentation,
you're taking me back to like.
Well, I was a teacher. I taught biology, physiology.
Okay,
kind of
that's great.
And so a lot of the things that you said resonated with me because I am not an authority figure. So like I constantly had to just throw things out there. I'm like, hey, there's this cool thing called evolution. You want to talk about it? But one of the things that I always had trouble with was, as the instructor, parsing between propaganda and documentation. So like, what history likes to tell us versus what's actually true. So like, how do you scrutinize those details as an instructor, and then like, how do you imbue your students with the ability to think critically in the same way?
Well, the second one's the very hard one, right? Because the goal of all this, right, the goal of this sort of framework is actually what you're actually, if you're setting the simulation, you're setting these things, there's a lot of things that are open for them to have to figure out, right? And you're going to trust that they're going to figure out their own way to do it, and they have examples, right? So you're really trying to teach critical thinking. On the problem of propaganda, yeah, it's really real, and like that's why you actually work with the documents, right? You look at what's there, and you try and find as many ways as possible to compare. And like the more the document is a report of information, rather than like journalism is completely unreliable at all times. And this isn't like a fake news thing. It's like no, unless you have multiple sources plus some documentation, like a police report, which is like has its own bias, but is also information, right? Like the closer you get to like, you know, like I love census reports, right? Because they're just like a source of information that tell you a lot about what was recorded then, but of course also they're not complete. Like history is always incomplete. And the more you can sort of create that framework, right? Like this is what we know now. If we find something else, we might know something else later. Which actually goes to the idea that I don't actually stress enough, but like the invention of ignorance. This is from Yuval Noah Harari, who wrote *Sapiens*. But like the invention of ignorance is the most important thing, to remind people that like nobody knows it, and that's okay. And there's a lot of things we do know, and you can test them and you can find out more.
Can I have a follow-up question?
Yeah.
Did you use all the Adventure Time gifts on purpose? Because I love them.
Yes. Yes, okay. I use them on purpose because I love them.
Yes.
And that's part of the thread. Like indulge yourself in interesting ways, right?
I used to do the same thing. I literally built a math quizzing application that, if they got it right, it would play sections of Adventure Time.
See, there you go.
They all loved it too.
Well, see, you both indulge yourself and engage with them. You did great.
Thank you so much.